Senator Harry Reid of Nevada died at the very end of December. He was 82 years old. He had served in the Congress and in the Senate for 30 more years, so 34 years in all. And he made a really pronounced impact on our country. Not only is he credited by Obama for being the person who got in his face and said, the time is now, you need to run, but as the Senate Majority Leader for a long spell, he passed a lot of key legislation, strong-armed his way through it. He's the person who got the votes in the Great Recession of 2008 for the Recovery Act that kept more millions of Americans from falling into despair and losing their house. He's the person who got the votes for Obamacare, for the Affordable Care Act. So he made a huge impact on this country. He was not known for catering to the rich and powerful. He once said that in his 34 years in Congress and Senate, he was invited to 136 black tie events and he went to one. And whenever he met someone, especially interviewing someone, he was less interested in the person who went to the Ivy League school and more interested in the person who had to scrap their way and make it to where they could on their own hard work. And he identified with that, no doubt. He grew up like literally in abject poverty. He was born in a small town called Searchlight, Nevada. He lived in a house, a shack, made of salvaged railroad ties, and no running water, no indoor toilet. There were only two professions, it was said, in that town, mining and prostitution. And his father was a miner who drank way too much, and his mother did laundry for the brothel. There was just one school, 2 teachers for 8 grades, no high school, so he literally hitchhiked 45 miles one way each day to Henderson, Nevada to get an education. And he managed to get a scholarship and to go to college, and he managed to he was an amateur boxer, he was a fighter. He got a job through a guy who became the governor of Nevada, and he became a Capitol Hill policeman and put himself through law school in Washington, D.C. And then he didn't talk about Searchlight. He was embarrassed about where he was from. He didn't want anybody to see the picture of the shack where he grew up in. But then one day, he went to a lecture by Alex Haley at the University of Nevada. Alex Haley, for anybody my age or older, remembers he wrote the book Roots, which then became kind of one of the very first mini-series, right, in like 76, 77, kind of the history of slavery, Kunta Kinte, and it became, every single American watched it, right? And at this lecture, Alex Haley was talking about your roots, obviously a very different man from Harry Reid, and he said, you can't be ashamed of where you're from. You've got to claim it. You've got to own it. You've got to be who you are. And Harry Reid said it changed his life. And he walked out of there, and from then on, he was Harry Reid from Searchlight, Nevada. And he spent his entire life battling for the poor, the working class, the middle class. That's exactly who he was and what he was about. And this morning, we meet Jesus, and he's the Harry Reid Jesus. Luke is clear. This is a partisan Jesus. This is a radical Jesus. This is not the rabbi Jesus that we meet in Matthew's gospel. And we've heard that from the very first pages of Luke's gospel. Remember Mary's Magnificat? My soul magnifies the Lord. He's looked with favor upon this lowly servant. He's lifted up the poor and filled the hungry with good things and scattered the rich in their imagination and sent the proud and the full, empty, hungry away. And then Jesus inaugurates his ministry with those words in Luke 4, Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He's called me to preach good news to the poor, release to the captives, and on it goes. So there's no surprise that the poor have shown up today to hear Jesus on the plain speak a good word. They've come to hear a good word. They've come to be healed and cured. They've come to be empowered. But they're not the only ones who come. We also know that the rich showed up too, because Jesus had a word for them as well. Woe to you who are rich, for you've received your consolation. And woe to you who are full, because you will be hungry later. Now, I'm going to be honest, that feels sort of harsh to me, because if there's just 2 groups, the poor and the rich, especially if you're looking at world standards, well, we had some folks in our 20s in our church who got a lot of debt, and we got some artists and some small business owners and a couple of people who've chosen solidarity with the poor. But for by and large folks, if you know world standards, then you got cars and you got bathrooms and you got plural of those kind of things, you're rich, right? And it sort of stings because, let me just be honest, Peace Church, we're the good rich. You know, really, we're good people. I mean, none of us here are happy with the growing inequality, right? Nobody here is happy that a black kid, as long as they're not safe on the street, not safe in their home, not really safe anywhere, right? I mean, we're all not, and we're not Jeff Bezos crazy rich, distant, right? We're not the top people are just trying to gobble it up more and more. And yet, at least I see it myself, it's true that the more you have, the more you can get distance from other people, right? The more you can be safe, the more you can be away. And what social science teaches us is that distance can kind of starve our spirit and kind of make us be less compassionate. And you have to really work. You have to have exposure. You have to push yourself, right, to see different people and encounter different people, to push past that. Paul Piff is a professor of psychology at University of California, Irvine, and he studies the rich. And he didn't intend to. He intended to study compassion, but he kept studying and he kept finding this inverse correlation between compassion and wealth. And, you know, some of it's simple little studies and, you know, surveys, things they've done with students there, like you put a kid on the corner trying to cross the street, and the more expensive the car, less likely they'll slow down for the person in the crosswalk. And some of it's kind of physiological changes that they can hook you up to an EKG, and when we feel compassion, our heart slows down. And this is averages. Obviously, there's a lot of people in a Mercedes stopping and helping people pick up their books, right? It's an average. But if you take a group of people, some who are poor, some who are wealthy, and you show them a neutral video, and then you show them a video of kids on chemotherapy, the poor people both report feeling more compassion and their heart slows down more. And then there's, you know, other kind of funny studies. Some of you may have seen the Monopoly study. There was a TED Talk that Paul Piff did about it where, you know, he kind of starts the Monopoly game and he rigs it, you know, and everybody knows it's rigged. Like, one person gets twice as much money and they go around the board twice as many times. They get twice as much money when they pass go. And as the game goes on, the person who has more sort of starts taking up more room around the board and starts being more aggressive and talking louder and even eating more pretzels in the bowl. You know, and then after you ask people about it, because of course the person who got twice as much and keeps getting to it, they won. And when you ask them about it, they're like 80% likely to talk about their strategy, as opposed to, no, the thing was rigged, right? And I guess, you know, the challenge here, and what Paul Piff is trying to do, is not bash one group of people. He's also trying to say compassion is something we can develop, right? Because, and it's important to do that, because if you also show people videos and documentaries about children in poverty and keep doing that, you know, they begin to vote differently. They begin to be more open. And the reason this is important is because the top 10% in this country are less supportive of public education, racial equity, and environmental protection. And when you look at the top 10% in the 90, when there's disparate, but the top 10% are getting what they want. And so it's really important, right, for all of us to keep trying to be more compassionate and to grow. And clearly, that's what Jesus is trying to do too. Because he doesn't just say, whoa, and he's done, right? No, the rest of the gospel is this unfolding challenge, this invitation to turn around and change and be different, right? To bridge the gap. So we'll hear that passage in Luke, coming up, Luke 16, where there's the rich man and the poor man, Lazarus, and talk about the chasm that's there and how do you try to bridge that. But just when we think we've got it all figured out, right? We've got our neat category, you know, we've got, you know, the Jeff Bezos that we can look down on, right? We've got the rich and the poor, we've got all of our things. Jesus throws us a curve, because the blessing is not just, blessed are you poor, blessed are you hungry, it's blessed are you who weep, right? It's blessed are you who feel excluded and rejected. And so what Jesus has really done is what create a category that like includes everybody, right? Because I don't know anybody who hasn't suffered. I don't know anybody who hasn't wept. I don't know anybody who hasn't felt left out. So somehow he's kind of done this kind of about face where instead of like pushing us out completely, we realize our lives are complicated. Like, I'm a person who has plenty and can be challenged to grow. And I'm also a person who, I have lost a lot in my life, right? I have grieved and I have needed to be comforted. Senator Harry Reid knew that. He knew that people suffered. He spent his entire life trying to make it different. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, it was personal to him. When he was a little kid, his brother broke his leg and they couldn't go to the doctor. His father had a tooth that needed to be pulled. His father pulled the tooth himself. When he was a kid in high school, hiking all that way, hitchhiking, he also had 2 jobs so he could make enough money so that he could buy a set of teeth for his mother. And his father, the drinker, committed suicide as a young man, really. And all of his life, Harry Reid thought, if he could have just gotten some care, right? Could have just had somebody who could help him understand himself a little bit better. Maybe the world would have been different. Harry Reid didn't just care about the poor, he cared about people who grieved too. If you know anything about him, you know he was completely tactless, abrupt, often said the wrong thing. You know, after his death in December, President Biden said, because he would always, when he was done with the conversation, Harry Reid would just hang up. And President Biden said, every time I hear a dial tone, I think of Harry Reid. You know, that's just who he was. And he was constantly putting his foot in his mouth, and his staff was constantly having to clean up for him. And they did it loyally. They loved him. Everybody loved him because one-on-one, in person, kindest person you ever met. Most gentle, most generous. It didn't matter if you were in the Capitol working as the janitor or you were the president. Harry Reid treated you with the same dignity and care. Some of you remember Senator Paul Wellstone. He was, like Senator Reid, a pretty unlikely candidate to be a U.S. Senator. He was the son of Jewish immigrants, got a PhD in political science, went to Carleton College where he was a professor, a little town in Minnesota, became a community organizer. When he ran for the United States Senate in 1990, nobody expected him to win. He was running against a Republican incumbent who was outspent 7-1. He was so far on the left part of the Democratic Party, like he was falling off of it, right? But he snuck up and he won. He was the one vote in '92 against the Iraq War. I mean, he was just a liberal's liberal. And then he squeaked by in 1996 and won again. And then in 2002, many of you remember, 11 days before the election, tragically, he was killed in a plane crash on his way to a funeral. It wasn't just Senator Wellstone who died, though. His wife, their daughter, 2 pilots, and 3 staff. And Senator Harry Reid was one of the first people to go to Minnesota. He flew in that day, got a little private plane, so that he could travel around the state of Minnesota to bring words of comfort to people. Paul Wellstone's young press secretary, she just graduated a year or 2 before from University of Michigan, Natalie Ravitz, she was supposed to be on that plane too, but there'd been a schedule change at the last minute. So instead, she was there to drive Senator Reid around the state of Minnesota that day. I mean, in shock, no doubt, right? Because she'd lost her boss, I mean, she'd lost her campaign, and one of the 3 staff who was killed was her 23-year-old boyfriend, Will McLaughlin. So at the end of that night, Senator Reid was about to leave, and someone must have told him about the relationship that this young woman had with this young man. And so he asked her if they could have a word together, if she would get in the plane with him. And she wrote about this in December after Senator Reid died. She talked about the kindness. She had been kind of hesitant, and this had been 19 years ago, and they got in the plane and sat there, just the 2 of them. And he talked to her about how frightened she must be. He could imagine she might never want to get in a plane again. Do you remember he kind of talked about all the gadgets on the plane, how growing up the way he did, he just thought it was such a wonder how those planes took off. And they talked together about Senator Wellstone, a person of incredible integrity. And they talked about Will. She told him how they had planned to move to Washington, D.C. together. And before he left, he said, "You always have a job with me. You can start now, start in a month, start whenever." And she talked about how he kept calling. Senator Reid would call her again and again to check on her, find out how she was doing. She ended up going to work for Senator Barbara Boxer. And so over the next 6-7 years, her path would cross with Senator Reid. And she wrote about this extremely important night, another night when they were together. It was Christmas Eve. 2009, Senator Reid was trying to get the votes for the Affordable Care Act. He was not going to let the senators go home for Christmas until he got the votes. And he had some senators here and some senators there, and he was strong-arming and back-arming them. They were dealing and wheeling and getting what they wanted for their state. And she talked about how hungry they were. There was nothing to eat. Someone found like a tin with some cashews and nuts and cookies. And she remembered that Senator Reid was teasing Senator Schumer for eating all the cashews. And then when they finally got the votes, they called President Obama. They told him, 31 million Americans, right? How many kids with a broken leg, right? How many sisters with cancer, right? How many dads with an addiction and need somebody? They called President Obama. They told him. He said, thank you. And then they cheered. And then they went out on that snowy Christmas Eve, right? Out into this world. Just when we think we've got the world all divided up, a word of blessing comes. It's to the poor, it's to the hungry, it's to the grieving, it's to any of us who felt left out. And we find out that we're really on this plane, all of us together, somehow, all of us together, in this word of blessing, this word that blesses us and encourages us so much, so that we can reach out, right, to a young woman who's just lost every single thing, and to the person close to us who we love the most. We can reach out, and we can grow, and we can love even more. Amen.